Hello, everyone. This is my first time doing Facebook Live by myself, so I'm very excited to make that happen. Uh, it is very nice to meet everyone. I'm proud to be doing this presentation for Sports for Hope and Independence in Bangladesh. I want to thank Papu and Sharman for inviting me to this and for holding my hand to do the Facebook Live all by my big self. So it is nice to meet all of you. I'm going to just use some slides in the background just to keep me on track and on time. But um, my name is Debra Rue, and I'm the CEO of Rue Global Impact. And I come from the banking industry. I come from the banking industry. I was in the banking industry for 25 years. And I also am a wife and a mother, and I have two grown children now. And my oldest is a daughter that was born with Down syndrome. And when my daughter was born with Down syndrome, really when she was diagnosed with Down syndrome, I started getting all these um, condolences and I'm so sorry. Oh, you must be so upset. And I was upset. I didn't really know what to expect of raising a child with Down syndrome, but at the same time, she was still a person and my child and my daughter. And I um, I wasn't really sure that always the appropriate feedback that I wanted to get from my friends was that they felt sorry for me that I had a baby with Down syndrome. So, as our life continued and she reached middle school, we started once again, and it had happened all along. We were being told what she couldn't do and what she couldn't accomplish. And she was, by the way, accomplishing everything that they said that she wouldn't. She did walk, she did talk, I remember when she was born, they told us she might not walk, she might not talk. Maybe I could put her in an institution, which why would I put my baby in an institution when I'm perfectly capable of taking care of her? So there was a lot of negativeness around my daughter being born with Down syndrome, and I just did not really understand because we're all born with abilities and disabilities, and we gain them and lose them all through our lives. And so to decide that my daughter wasn't worthy because she had Down syndrome, I thought was really a mistake to society. So I decided whenever she was in when she reached our middle school, which is sixth grade, and once again, I was hearing she can't join the workforce, she's going to add no value to society. And I really disagreed, but at the same time, I sort of woke up to some of the realities that people with disabilities were having to deal with all over the world. Certainly here in the United States, where I live. I did forget to mention I'm joining from Virginia in the United States during this really ridiculous, interesting, fearful COVID 19 crisis. And the United States, we're not really handling it very well. So we're certainly not being a good role model in any way to the rest of the world of how to deal with a pandemic. Lots of fighting, um, a lot of fighting for the rights. And it's interesting here in the United States, we really do care about people's rights, and yet we obviously have some pretty significant problems with police violence against individuals that have darker skin. And unfortunately, that's something that happens all over the world. I don't know who decided that if you had lighter skin, you were somehow better than people with darker skin, because that's certainly ridiculous. It's ridiculous to judge people on the color of their skin, where they're from, which god they worship or they don't worship a god, if they love somebody of the same sex. We are human beings. We're diverse, amazing human beings. We're made up of a whole lot of different parts, and we change as we go through our lives. Right now, my husband of almost 40 years, we're about 2 years away from 40 years, but he has early onset dementia. And he got that because when he was a child, he was hit by a car. When he was 11 years old, he actually hit the car. He ran in front of a car accidentally when he was getting his kite flying well. And unfortunately, because of the severity of his accident, as he aged, his brain aged differently. But that doesn't mean that my husband doesn't add value to society and that, people don't love him and he doesn't love us and things like that. So we're human beings, and by the sheer nature of who we are diverse, and there's such beauty in diversity. There's such beauty in learning and talking to other people from other walks of life, and people. I get my most joy out of talking to people with disabilities, and keep in mind that many disabilities are hidden. In the United States, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that act for us is very important legislation. And we often sue each other. We litigate and do lawsuits against each other in the United States if we think that you are not following our laws. That's just part of our society. And the Americans with Disabilities Act is going to be 30 years old in July. So we are celebrating as we're fighting over everything in the United States, but also we're celebrating the Americans with Disabilities Act from 30 years ago. From that act, other laws were created. There are disability laws all over the world, including, um, you know, people, many almost all countries, to be honest, have signed the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, CRPD. And most countries have signed and ratified it. The United States have signed it, but we did not ratify it. Unfortunately, we're one of the few countries that has not shown leadership, in my opinion, by not joining the global CRPD, the Global United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And the reason why it matters is because even though we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, and once again, it's a wonderful act, and over these 30 years, we have continued to update that legislation. Always we could do more, but we haven't just created the law and then let it sit there. We have updated it over the years. But the way that we define being a person with a disability in the United States is different from how the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is defined. There's just some small differences, but sometimes there's significant differences depending upon the lens that you're looking at it from. So I wanted to just make that comment first, that there are laws. I know that, for example, I was talking to somebody from India yesterday, and they were telling me that there is a law that says that you do have to hire people with disabilities, and if not, you have to give 5% of your profits towards people with disabilities. And I might have that a little messed up because I just heard it yesterday. So that might not be exact, but we see countries legislating the inclusion of people with disabilities, but it still is a real push and pull. We find that actually we have to fight for our rights to be included. And so I work with global corporations, and I try I try to make sure that they understand why it is so important to include people with disabilities, certainly in the workforce from the corporation's viewpoint, but also you should be hiring people with disabilities that have created their own businesses if they have services that your corporation could benefit from. So people with disabilities should be your vendors. People with disabilities are your customers. People with disabilities add value to every aspect of society if society will let us add value. And so I talk a lot about inclusion of people with disabilities, certainly from this perspective of including people with disabilities in the workforce, but it's very important that people with disabilities be included in everything, that people with disabilities be included in sports. Sports are so important because that's how we learn almost to get along with each other. That's how we learn to be team players. That's how we learn to set goals and to fulfill our dreams. I mean, sports are very, very important in the world, and including people in sports, especially people with disabilities, is very valuable, once again, to the individuals, to the families, to communities, but also to your society. I remember when my daughter she was a young girl. Maybe she was, I can't even remember her age, but maybe she was about 10 to 12 years old. And she has a little brother. Her brother's about 15 months younger than her. and her brother had joined the swim team, so we were taking him to the swim team, and he was practicing, but nobody with a disability had ever been on the swim team, so my daughter, wasn't included. And so as my son, and now just for a time reference, my daughter is 33 years old and my son is 31. And so this is 15, years plus ago. But at the time, it's still, we were not doing a good job of inclusion. And we still need to do some work, but we've made strides. So the coach saw my daughter playing in the water and she said, does she want to join, just, practicing? And so my daughter was thrilled. So she joined, she started practicing with the team, and then they put her on the team. So she was the first person in my community, my little small rural community in Virginia, that was included on the swim team. And so they made really nice accommodations for her because she wasn't the fastest swimmer, but she got so much joy out of swimming. And it also was interesting that when she would swim and we would have the swim meets, everybody from both teams, her team and the visiting team or the team that we were swimming against, they always celebrated her swimming. They were all cheering and encouraging her and talking to her. And it was just a really, really beautiful experience, and an experience that still warms my heart to this day, because of course I want my daughter included and she wants to be included. So it's pretty, we still have a lot of work to do, but I believe we've made some progress. But when we're talking about inclusion of people with disabilities, we really need to talk about it from the lens of being included in everything. So that means being included in housing. That means being included in transportation. That means being included in sports, which we talked about briefly. That means being included in employment and in education, every single aspect of society. And during times right now, during these really, it's just surreal, these times, especially once again, sitting in the United States, watching what's happening, watching the president of the United States have our military, you know, shoot our peaceful protesters with rubber bullets and tear gas, just so that they can get a photo opportunity in front of a burned church. It's very hard for Americans right now to try to understand what's happening. And once again, we will, I hope, never forget how important it is to vote for whatever way you believe. So, but as we're doing it, we're seeing people's rights um, being taken away from them, but also we're seeing where the issues are in our country, because people with disabilities, they still are not being really, really included. One of my coworkers, his name is Lamondre Pugh, Lamondre, and then the last name is Pough. I would highly recommend looking him up because he has a really powerful podcast, and he himself is a person with a disability. He was born with a type of muscular dystrophy, and he has such a powerful voice. He has a show called Five Ps that is really, he honors the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And of those 17 Sustainable Development Goals, 11 of them relate to people with disabilities. So he is a man with a visible disability, and he also is an African American. So he is um, a Black man in the United States, and he is having very powerful conversations during these times as an individual that is disabled and an individual that is darker skinned in the United States, which we have pretty significant problems with that right now, police violence, and things like that. So it's it's very interesting listening to his voice and learning from him. And I think that's something, it's another reason that we would make sure that we are including people with disabilities, because they have different perspectives than the rest of us. And so it's very, very interesting having him talk about, through the lens of an African American, for example, but also through the lens of his experience as a person with living with a physical disability. Oh, one thing I want to note is just a few of the statistics around people with disabilities. According to the World Health Organization, and this is an old number, but they haven't updated this report, in 2010, they estimated that there were 1 in 7 people in the world living with disabilities. Now, most of us, including the World Health Organization, feel those numbers are probably much lower, but not all countries do census, and not all individuals that have disabilities identify on the census that they have those disabilities. And so, according to the World Health Organization, 1 in 7, which would be almost a billion people. And then there are other numbers we see in the UK, in Canada, in Europe. They say, and I believe Australia is saying this as well, 1 in 5 of their citizens have disabilities. And then in the United States, according to our CDC, and this was done in a couple of years ago, 1 in 4 Americans, adult Americans, identify as having a disability. So the numbers are staggering. And to leave out people with disabilities and not include people with disabilities, you're talking about a lot of people, not to mention that people can move in and out of the community of people with disabilities. People can be temporarily disabled. People can be, they can. I remember I had a sports injury one time, and speaking of sports, and I hurt the back of my leg so bad that I didn't walk for almost 10 weeks. And I was really surprised at the subtleness of how people treated me different. Now, this was a temporary disability, and I identify as a person with a disability. I have ADHD, and that has all these lovely anxiety and depression and intensity that goes with it. But at the same time, it also makes me who I am. It makes me very conscious of wanting to make a difference. It made me be motivated to create a business. So I don't really see it as a disability. I see it as an advantage, and I think other people are starting to see that. We see Greta Thunberg talking about climate action and climate strike, and she is very proud to call herself a person with autism, and she calls it her superpower. So I'm hoping that as the world tries to figure out who it is, and we really re-examine, especially what we're doing in some of the countries, who are we, and who are we as individuals, and who are we collective and community, and all of that, that we're going to really take the time to understand that we all add value, especially if we are included. So if people with disabilities are not being educated, which we know is happening during this COVID-19 virus crisis, when 97% of the world went home, sheltering in place, 40% of children could not access the internet, or didn't have the technology they needed to virtually do education. Now, this wasn't just individuals with disabilities, but this was children that don't have the same access to technology and the internet that others do. But at the same time, children with disabilities were, they had a much more difficult time, because often they might have to use assistive technology or need accommodations. Those things, if they're lucky, might be provided at their schools, but it probably hasn't made it home. And so I know that's the case in the United States. Sometimes we'll accommodate an individual with a disability in school, but then when they go home, they don't have those accommodations, so they don't have the same access to get on technology and to be educated. So I look at the lens from all these different things. And when going back to my daughter, when my daughter it was in the middle school, we were told once again she would never add value to the workforce. And I just did not understand why that was the case, because I knew my daughter was very creative. She was very smart. She learns differently. It takes her longer to learn something, but once she learns it, she's very good. Now, there's some things that she can't do. She just is not good at math. She just doesn't understand some of those kind of she doesn't understand money, for example. She doesn't understand math, but she's a very good communicator. She's a good reader, so she has other skills. And you hope that if somebody is going to judge you, that they're going to look at you across the board. In the first place, they shouldn't be judging you, but also they're going to look across the board and really, look at all the different facets that make up you as an individual. So I created a company called Tech Access, and Tech Access's focus was making sure that technology, the internet specifically at the time, web accessibility, that your websites were fully accessible to all of us, including people with disabilities. And the majority of my employees were people with disabilities, and I had people that worked for me that were quadriplegic, paraplegic, autism, Down syndrome, blind, deaf. I had an intern that was blind and deaf. The MD, MS, we were very, very diverse. Cerebral palsy. And what we all had in common were we were all technologists. Many were self-taught, and everybody had disabilities. And we really applauded the fact that we had disabilities because we felt that it gave us an edge over people that have not lived with some of those difficulties. I also found that many of my employees were wonderful problem solvers because I really don't think that people are disabled. I think society disables people. Society chooses, whether they are doing it consciously or unconsciously, to leave certain people out. So if you're blind, if you're deaf, if you're hard of hearing, or you have hearing loss, often you are not afforded the same access that everybody else has. And so we were really focused on technology. And in 2011, I merged that company with another company during the financial crisis when things got so tough. And then in 2013, I created Rue Global Impact. And what we do at Rue Global Impact is we really talk about the value that people with disabilities bring to society. And certainly we look at it often from the lens of employment. So how should a corporation include people with disabilities in their workforce? And I also really encourage the corporations, the global corporations that we work with, to not just look at it. I found at first that the companies I was working with, they only would hire people with disabilities in small numbers in the United States or say the United Kingdom. But they wouldn't do it where their footprint was. So say that they had employees in Bangladesh, they weren't doing it there. They had employees in India, they had employees in China or wherever. They would only be doing it, say, in the United States and the United Kingdom. And so I started talking about that and telling them that how I thought it looked, because what it looked like to me was that they were only including people with disabilities in their workforce, say in the United States and the United Kingdom, because we had laws that demanded it. And in the United States, we were actually suing you if you were not including people with disabilities in your workforce, or your website, your HR systems were not fully accessible. And so I just tried to get the brands to think, the corporations, I call them brands, I tried to get them to think about it from the lens of, why aren't you including people with disabilities? Why are you not looking at us from, as employees? Why are you not looking at people that already work for you that have disabilities? Maybe they acquired a disability as they were working for you. I'm not saying they got hurt on the job. Sometimes we do, but sometimes you get hurt just in living your life. And so I really wanted the corporations to really think from a different lens, because of people that, if you look at the community of people with disabilities, 80% of people with disabilities acquire the disabilities after birth. So you have someone like my daughter, she was born. This is who she was from the moment she was conceived. She had Down syndrome. And so it was just part of who she is. She also, was born with, blonde hair and, brown eyes. So it's just part of her makeup. It's part of her DNA. But most people with disabilities acquire them after the fact, 80%. And as we age and society is aging all over the world, we see a society aging. Here in the United States, we have 70 million people that are over the age of 56. And now the numbers in the US, we always like to think of ourselves as a big country, but the reality is, we have about the numbers are shifting right now, but about 320 million. Sometimes I hear 340 million, 300 million, but it's right around there. So I'll go with the average one, 300 million people, just because, right now we're losing some of those people due to COVID-19, and also due to just, people, get sick, they get cancer, and they pass away. So we looking at making sure that people with disabilities are fully included and valued in society, is the work that we do at my company. We are strategists. We work with, once again, I mentioned global corporations, but we also work with UN agencies, we work with governments, we work with nonprofits and academia to really help them make sure they're meaningfully including people with disabilities, because sometimes I see efforts being made, but they're not very meaningful and they don't really have very good impact. And my company right now, we are in the process of creating an impact investing fund, because because we've been waiting for corporations to do the right thing by people. And I'm just tired of waiting. I'm just tired of waiting because there are efforts being made. One of the best stories I heard actually comes from Bangladesh, and I want to tell you this story because I tell this story all the time, and I think it's pretty amazing. And I've talked about some of these stories in my books too. My latest book is Inclusion Branding, where I'm talking about this. But the Cisco was employing people in Bangladesh, and they wanted to employ people that were blind, and so they hired a team of employees that were blind in Bangladesh, and they were really surprised. They were really surprised because they got good workers, and I think maybe that didn't surprise them. Maybe they knew they were going to get good workers, but what did surprise them was the response the customers had, because the customers would not know that the agent they were talking to was in Bangladesh. They didn't know that the individual was blind, but they found that they got much, much better scores from the customers. They were much more empathetic. They were very caring. They were really good problem solvers. And once again, that's what I said earlier. People with disabilities that have not been included have no choice but to become better problem solvers, because society accidentally or consciously excludes people with disabilities. And so they were really surprised at the quality of the employees that had disabilities in Bangladesh that they were bringing on board, and actually started expanding. So that's one wonderful story, and we have other wonderful stories. There's a story, this story is old, but I love it. It was the story of Canon, the camera makers. They do copiers and printers, and they do a lot of cameras for medical equipment. So a lot of us know about the Canon brand. And so what they did, and this was years ago. This was, I think, 2008, maybe even a little, maybe even a bit before that. But Canon, as a corporate brand, is also very committed to the environment, which is important to me as well, and should be important to all of us, because this is the earth we're living on. But so they, at the time, if you got a Canon Canon camera and something went wrong with it, they would throw it away. But they wanted to, as a matter of fact, I think this was probably closer to 1998. So I think my numbers were off by about 10 years, but I forget exactly when, but it's been a little while ago. So they wanted to make sure that they were responsibly disposing of these cameras. But at the same time, they thought there might be an opportunity to employ people with cognitive or intellectual disabilities, like my daughter with Down syndrome. Some people with autism are like that, people with intellectual disabilities. And so they brought in a small group, and they taught them how to take these cameras apart. They dismantled these cameras. They determined which pieces had to be responsibly disposed of, which pieces could be reused, which pieces were, fine. So they broke them into different categories. And the good news is they saved $19 million that first year, just not throwing these cameras away and making sure the pieces that were viable could be used or repaired or responsibly disposed of. But Then, and they did what they always do at the end of the year, they take a look at, employee satisfaction. And they found that this one plant outside of Chicago, that the employees' satisfaction overall went up by about 30%. In this one place right outside Chicago, which just happened to be the place that was doing this project with the cameras, with the employees with intellectual disabilities. And so they looked to find that they really dug in to find out why were all of the employees being more productive and more happy, because productivity went up by 30%. And they found the reason why was because the employees were really proud of Canon for employing these individuals with intellectual disabilities. And we find that when people are proud of their employers, they're more productive. So I just love this story. And then we have many, many, many others. But at the same time, I still think corporations need to pick up their game. I think right now they're still acting like it's a novelty instead of really understanding the value that people with disabilities bring to society. And I'll tell you another story that's a funny story about AI. And I talk about this in my book too. But Sandy Carter, that works for Amazon, she's an executive with Amazon. She was on my show, Human Potential at Work. And she was talking about, she told me the story about Barbie. So Mattel makes Barbie, and they wanted to take one of the Barbies and give her artificial intelligence. And so a group coded her, programmed her so that she could answer simple questions. And so she was in a dialogue with a young girl at a conference, and it started something like this. Barbie saying to the young girl, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Like adults say to kids. And the little girl said, "I want to be a computer scientist." And Barbie said, "Well, have you thought about a career in fashion?" Well, that was a mistake. And the women in the audience were furious with Mattel about this. And then it turned out that Barbie had been programmed by a small group of males. It was only men in the group. If they had included one woman or a woman with a disabilities or women in any way, women would have known immediately that was not going to be the right answer, because women are very capable of being in sciences, technologies, mathematics, engineering. Women are as capable as men. Just like people with disabilities are as capable as people without disabilities, especially if they're accommodated, if they are provided adaptations so that they can do their work. And by the way, we provide accommodations, adaptations to employees all day long to help keep them productive. For example, when we all went home, I already worked from home. My team has been teleworking for, 15 years, but well, I guess it's closer to 20 years now. But when we all went home, that was an accommodation because we were trying to flatten the curve and make sure more people didn't get the COVID-19 virus. But all of this work that we've been doing for years and years with accessibility and not really being paid attention to by the corporations, now they understand what we're saying. Technology can be a great equalizer, but it must be accessible to everyone. And so there's still so much work to do, but I think one thing that I really encourage our community to do is we need to really own who we are. We really need to value who we are. And if you are a parent that has a child with disabilities, fight for their education. Make sure they get educated. And if for some reason you can't get them to a traditional school, homeschool them. But we all have to be educated and we all have to be included. And, as people age, more people acquire disabilities. And so one thing that we're finding all over the world, but I'll speak from the lens of the United States, is that right now here in the United States, as I mentioned, there are over 70 million Americans that are over the age of 56, but that part of our demographic, they still control 60% of the wealth of the United States. So these are high net worth individuals, quite a few of them, and the company and in most companies all over the world, there are 5 generations working in these global firms. So you have executives often that are now acquiring disabilities And it's becoming really real to them as well. And then once again, as we send everybody home to telework, we realized how inaccessible the technology was and how unreliable our internet connections were, which is why I talk a lot about why it's so important to have digital inclusion. You need to make sure that we all have access to the internet, especially if that's the way we're going to work and that's the way we're going to get educated. We all have to have technology that works. We have to have the accommodations or the adaptions to make us be able to utilize our technology, and things have to be fully accessible, which once again we've been saying for a really long time, but I think now the world is starting to understand. And I don't know, sometimes it takes you having to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes to understand that there really is value to society in all people being included. And so I'm getting more and more hopeful, but at the same time, I'm getting impatient. I feel impatience because I'm tired of the corporations not including people with disabilities meaningfully. There's this one big corporation that I won't name their name, that they're gigantic, global corporation. They have hundreds of thousands of people working for them, but they hired 5 people with autism, so they think they're done. Yay! And I'm glad they hired 5 people with autism, because people with autism add so much value to the workforce, but you're not done. You're just beginning. Include all of us, and let's do this all the way across the board, because we have to work to pay our bills. We have to work to be independent. And so work needs to be accessible to all of us, but our homes need to be accessible. Our vehicles need to be accessible. Our trains, our buses, our planes, which some of these things we're not using right now, but they have to be accessible. So we have to look at the inclusion of people with disabilities through every single one of these lenses, because as my guest, Sports for Hope and Independence, that name suggests, sports teaches so much about how to play together, how to be together. It really ignites us. It inspires us. There's just so much that we learn from sports. So we all need to be included from the very beginning in sports. If we want to be in sports, we should not be not included because of a disability. Independence. My daughter moved out about 9 months ago, and she got very sick in 2018. And so she'd been wanting to move out, but as mom, I just didn't want her to move out until I knew that she was safe. So she moved out, and she actually has been sheltering in place with her roommate that also has a disability. And it's what we call a supported apartment. So she has a staff that supports her during the COVID-19 virus, just to stay safe. But she loves being independent. And it's independence with accommodations, but she loves it. She doesn't want to live at home with her parents, because traditionally in the United States, that's not what we do. We want to be independent, and we move out and we have our own homes. Now, I think we can learn a lot from other societies right now, because maybe we've been a little bit too independent in the United States, and we're finding that there's value in coming together more as families and communities. So the other day I was on a webinar for People Hum, who is in India, located in India, and they asked me this really powerful question about did I think that the Western had really focused on the individuality, and the Eastern has sort of focused on community, and what could we learn from both of those movements? And I think what we're learning, those of us focused on the individuality, and we are individuals, we do want to be taken seriously, but we're also collective and part of a community. So I think there's a lot of things the Western world needs to learn from the Eastern world. We say developing, then developed. I'm starting to think that maybe we could learn developed countries. I'm not starting to. I believe for sure that the developed countries can learn so much from the developing, and I also hope that the developing countries don't follow the path of the developed countries, because it seems like it's only for certain people, these dreams. If you're a person with a darker skin color, maybe those dreams aren't for you. If you're a person with a disability, maybe it don't matter. If you're this, if you're that, and I think it's ridiculous. I think it is about all of us finding our path, all of us finding our purpose. Once again, the sports for hope and independence. Well, hope can take us such a long way. Sometimes just hoping that things are going to get better can get me through a hard place. But at the same time, at the end of the day, we need to stop always having only hope there. We need to make sure we have action and that we're truly included. I want to see more politicians with visible disabilities. I want to see more actresses and actors and musicians with physical disabilities. I want to see more executives and politicians with disabilities, because people with disabilities matter and they add so much great contributions to the world. And we have to do a much better job of accepting who an entire person is, instead of saying, well, I don't really like this one quality about you, so I'm just not going to even include you, because that's not good for society. And I talk about that often on my shows and in my books. But at the same time, I would say to people with disabilities, you also need to find your voice. Even if you're a person that can't speak, I have my Chief Accessibility Officer, Rosemary Musashio. She does not speak in the traditional way. She's nonverbal, and she uses augmented communications devices for her voice. But don't underestimate her, because she's very smart, very smart, very brilliant. She has a lot to say. And it would be a shame to society if Rosemary was not included in the workforce and included in every other aspect of her life that she wants to be included with. Hopefully, everything that she wants, that she's fully included in. And of course, that's not true. She has to fight all the time for basic rights that she should have. So we've made progress, but there's so much more progress to do. So I mentioned briefly that my company is going to create an impact investing fund. And the reason why we're doing it is because we're just sort of tired of the corporations not taking this seriously and the society not taking this seriously. And they throw us a little, scrap, and we're supposed to be glad that, yay, oh, you look at you, you hired one person with a disability. Well, I think that's ridiculous, and I don't think that's the way to work. And now we're moving towards artificial intelligence and all the unconscious bias against people with disabilities and other minority groups. And so I think it's really important that companies like mine support people with disabilities, because that's what we're about. Make sure that there's good policies, make sure there's good strategy, but we spend a lot of time highlighting what people with disabilities all over the world is doing. We show them on our shows. I also run Access Chat, axschat.com, along with two other hosts, Neil Milliken and Antonio Santos. And we've been doing it for over 5 years with 8 billion tweets. So it's a tweet chat. And we talk about what's happening. We just spoke, our guest last week was a gentleman with severe hearing loss in India that is a photojournalist, and he's teaching people with disabilities to be photojournalists. And so we've had all these we've had Paralympic athletes on, we have corporations on that are talking about employing people with disabilities. We talk about how, driverless cars can be such a blessing to the community of people with disabilities, because sometimes people with disabilities can't drive. I know my daughter can't drive, and now my husband with dementia, he can't drive. So having these driverless cars could be such a blessing towards their independence. So we really are looking at these issues from all the different societal aspects. And once again, from the lens of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, where we all should be included. We're not broken human beings because we are born with a disability or we acquire a disability. We're just human beings with, maybe some extra opportunities. But it doesn't mean that we're broken or we can't add value. Once again, society disables people. People aren't disabled. Society disables people. So I'm looking forward to putting this fund out and really growing the fund, because I want to do even more to support people with disabilities to really find their place in society and take their place and find their voice and show the world the value that we add as individuals with disabilities, visible and invisible disabilities. I think it's also time for more people from different backgrounds to be speaking about these topics, not just people that are Caucasian like me over a certain age. We need to see different faces. We need to see people from all different walks of life, all over the world, talking about what they're experiencing, what their dreams are, how do they, what do they want to add to the world. And so there's so much work that still needs to be done, but I believe the younger generations, they don't see people often in the same way. They are a little bit more accepting. Now, I'm going to speak from the United States from that perspective, but I'm also seeing it all over the world. Younger people often seem collectively a little bit more evolved when it comes to inclusion. My son's 31, and he'll say, "Well, I don't understand. Why wouldn't you include somebody because they have a disability, because they're gay, because they don't believe in the same God you do, or they don't believe in God at all." It's just ridiculous to take people and put them in these little boxes and say they don't matter. So I believe that we could do a much better job of really, really honoring who we are as people. I also know that in some cultures, some religious beliefs and some cultures believe that if a person is born with a disability, that they did something wrong in a past life, or their family did something wrong, or it's a curse from God. It's not. It's just not. We are human beings. I believe we're spiritual beings having a human experience, and we're here um, because we're living these wonderful, beautiful lives with purpose, hopefully. But there's a reason why you're here, and we need to go within, and we need to really figure out why that is. But at the same time, we need to break down as many barriers as possible. So someone like me, that just because I'm white, the reality is I have extra privileges. Because I was born in the United States, I have extra privileges. There is some, it's not equal, and we know it's not equal. And so it's up to people like me that do have some extra privileges to make sure we're using those privileges to allow others to come in, for others to find their way. So I remember one day on Twitter, the hashtag white privilege was trending. And I went out there and I said, with my white privilege, I throw the door open behind me so that everybody else can come in, because we're here, I believe, to make the world a better place and to support each other. And so when Papa and Charmin asked me to do this live broadcast, I wanted to make sure I covered all these different things, because we have to stand up for our rights and say, stop it. I'm not disabled. Society's disabling me. And society, you need to do better than that. And we need to make sure our politicians hear that, our leaders hear that, and our corporations hear that as well. Because even though right now things are really bad in a lot of countries, the US very bad, we're at 20% unemployment. 40 million Americans have applied for unemployment. We haven't seen anything like this. While anybody that's alive hasn't seen this, because most people, I think, that survived the Depression, there's only a few people, I think, still living. I know my father-in-law, for example, he was in the Depression, but he passed away a couple of years ago. So some of our oldest members in the United States lived through the Depression, but the majority of us did not. And so we haven't seen this before. And so as we're almost rethinking what it means in our society, this is an opportunity to truly do a better job of including everyone and seeing everyone has value. And there's a lot of changes that have happened in the United States and other countries that it is really beautiful about accepting people with disabilities. But I know in a lot of countries, people with disabilities are still treated as fourth, fifth, sixth class citizens. They're not included. They're not educated. They're not being allowed to join the workforce. There's just a lot of problems still. Stigmas, unconscious and conscious biases. It's just amazing the work. But I do think if we pull together, we work together, we join by creating things like an impact investment fund where we invest in people that have ideas that will change the world, that maybe wouldn't be able to get traditional funding. I think things like this are going to be very important to move us forward. To the point where I'm just not going to wait anymore for corporations and leaders to wake up. We're going to do this together. So I'm really proud to have been on today. Um, I really take my work very seriously. My website is www.ruhglobal.com. I'm on social media everywhere. I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Instagram, many others, and mainly I'm on these places as Debra Ruh, Debraruh. Also, Ruh Global, RUH Global is on there, and then I have all these amazing, talented team members from all over the world that are very proud to have disabilities and very proud to be making a difference. And we're here for you. We want to tell your stories. We want to hear what you're doing. We believe in you. Um, and I just really believe that in the long run, we're going to learn a lot from these experiences we're walking right now with the COVID-19 virus. I hope that we're going to learn what it means to truly be human. But I wish you such, success in wherever you are. And please don't believe if anyone tells you you're not worthy because you have a disability, because it's ridiculous. You are not a mistake. You were born for a purpose. You you add value to the world. If somebody puts a barrier in your way, find a way around it, because that's when we become the strongest. So I really appreciate once again you having me on today, and together we're stronger. So be safe, be strong, and make sure that you don't let anybody get in your way, and find the people that join the tribes like our tribe that really believe that the world is better because people with disabilities are in it. And we're going to keep fighting to make sure, and how we're fighting is we're doing it with blogs and vlogs and Facebook lives and Zooms and Google chats and webinars, and we're doing everything we can to help take the scales away from the eyes of people that don't understand the value that people with disabilities bring to society. So thank you so much for having me, and everybody stay safe. Bye-bye.